recording. Okay, welcome again to our webinar. We're delighted to have you with us. So we're first going to hear from Rachel Marcus, who is a Senior Research Fellow at the Overseas Development Institute in the UK. And Rachel's going to be talking with us about findings from the literature on how we are able to change the social norms in the minds of not only young women, but the people who surround them, parents, partners, employers, other groups that influence and either enable or bar young women from becoming engaged in employment. So if you just bear with me one moment, I'm going to pull up Rachel's presentation. And Rachel, I will unmute you now. Find your oops. All right, Rachel, I'm having trouble finding. We've got a lot of participants online. There you are. All right, Rachel, you're on. I will get your presentation up. Thank you.
Thank you, Ritu. Good morning, afternoon, and evening, everybody, and thank you very much for this invitation. I'm going to talk about evidence from a couple of reviews I've undertaken over the last year. One of them was undertaken for IDRC in Canada, looking at a program of research called the GROW program, Growth and Women's Economic Opportunities. And the other was a review of projects specifically working with young people in Africa, undertaken for the MasterCard Foundation. Within ODI, I work on a program called the Advancing Learning and Innovation on Gender Norms program. And so I've just got a couple of slides up from that because you can get the reports I'm talking about from that platform if you'd be interested afterwards. Economic empowerment, could I have the next slide, please? Economic empowerment is one of the key areas that we are focusing on and hoping to build up within Align. And Align is both a website, but it's also very importantly a hub for a community of practice. We're really keen to showcase insights from around the world, from different kinds of thinkers, practitioners, researchers, policymakers involved in working to change harmful and discriminatory gender norms. So I would really welcome you to get in touch with us if there are thoughts or perspectives that you'd like us to showcase. So could I have the next slide, please? These are the two reports that I'm going to draw on in my presentation, just so you can see what they look like. And now if we can move on to the next slide, I'll get into some of the substance of the key findings that we found in these two reviews. So the review for IDRC focused very much on the different kinds of norms that that women in particular face in employment. And what Rita's asked me to reflect on is whether increased earnings can change or at least suspend gender norms. So I've picked out a few of the norms that the GROW studies focused on. And first of all, the big question of whether it's okay for women to work outside the home or not. And what we found was that the level of support for change was mixed. In some places where good opportunities had opened up, then norms had relaxed quite a lot and people saw it as more or less, well sensible, that, here's a good opportunity, why would a woman not take it up? In other cases, it was much more a question of men accepting it, but not thinking it was the ideal, that it was just that their economic situation meant that for the moment it made sense for women to be involved in work, but ideally their role as a male breadwinner meant they were the ones who should be providing, and they felt that their family was kind of violating the norm and the ideal, and they would like to go back to a situation where that wasn't the case. Another set of the studies looked at whether what the norms around women working in male-dominated trades were, or in entrepreneurship, and particularly in businesses where they had a lot of contact with men, or employment where they would have to have a lot of contact with men. And again, we found really variable patterns. In some parts of the world, people found that highly unacceptable, and it was a big obstacle among parents-in-law, particularly in parts of the world where a young woman will live with her husband's family, and parents-in-law will have a big influence over their decisions and about work and family and so on. So in those contexts, often there was still a really strong norm that women should not be working outside the home and should not be working in trades where they would be in contact with a lot of other men, because it was seen as damaging their reputation and therefore damaging family honour, and really highly risky. In other places, again, there was more relaxation, and I mean, the major difference that came out in the growth studies was really between a cluster of studies from South Asia, where there was more concern about women working in male-dominated areas, and some studies from East Africa, where if husbands were not necessarily happy about it, and also there was wider community gossip, at the same time it was more accepted that it was economic necessity, or here were good opportunities and it made sense to take them. One of the major clusters of issues around whether it was okay for women to be working in these areas or not was not just about their personal reputation, their family reputation, but the other side of their life. So the expectation that they should be primarily responsible for doing housework, for looking after children, for everything that was involved in keeping a family going, not only looking after children, sometimes it was also elderly dependents or a sick family member. But in the main, a lot of the criticisms focused around the impact on children. And interestingly, again, the studies from Rwanda and Tanzania noted more change in norms around men doing housework. That's not to say that loads of men were taking on housework and necessarily participating in an equal way, but the expectations around it being okay for them to do that has started to shift a bit. On the next slide, you'll see a couple of quotes showing how fluid it can be. One woman from Nepal whose husband was quite willing to take on more of the housework, again highlighting the role of community level gossip and family opposition to him doing that, which was in turn impacting on her ability to take up the kind of work that she was hoping to do. And if we could just go back to the previous slide. The growth studies also showed some insights around how people felt about using daycare, particularly community level creches and nurseries. And even where the norm was that it was primarily women's responsibility to bring up children, particularly when they were young, on the other hand, and quite surprisingly, studies both from India and Kenya showed that if people perceived that the children were actually getting something good at those nurseries, then the norm about whether it was okay to send children there and to, potentially for a whole day, potentially at a young age, actually shifted quite fast. So that was, I think, a surprise in the research. The other norm that we picked up on a little is perceptions about whether it was okay for women to live away from home. And these, again, were really bound up with the issues around reputation, whether she would be still marriageable if she gained a bad reputation by living away from home, potentially by engaging in a relationship, possibly even getting pregnant, but in general damaging her reputation. Versus, again, an acceptance that, well, here was an opportunity, it just made sense to make the best of it, particularly if she could live with a relative, or if she was going perhaps with some other girls from the village and there was a decent social network, then again, it was something that families tended to be happier about. So overall then, as you can see on the right of the slide, I mean, all of these, I've indicated that the level of change was mixed for all of these, and that, I think, reflects that the studies come from a really diverse set of situations. And so norms are very much related both to the local culture, which itself is so different among different ethnic groups and socioeconomic groups and religious groups and so on. And then at the same time, also these studies were looking across a wide area and quite a range of different economic situations, from factories starting up, from mining becoming an important opportunity in some places, to studies which focus more on women as entrepreneurs in different kinds of activities, some with women in really non-traditional areas like being taxi drivers. And so it's not surprising that there was really quite a range of reactions to these. But I think the polls that I've described were on the whole, more concern and conservatism in the studies from South Asia, which were particularly Bangladesh and a little bit from India and Nepal, and then more opening up and shift in norms in the studies that came from East Africa. So if we could move on to the next slide. The next one just summarizes some of the quotes from the people that were interviewed in these studies. And again, I mean, just to reiterate, these are not studies that I personally conducted, because the two pieces I did were reviews of other studies, but these were some of the quotes that came out in the pool of studies that we looked at. And again, although, like I said, although perhaps there was more shift in East Africa, the two quotes from Uganda shows that, that traditional so-called norms around the role of women and what kind of work is acceptable for them to do and what gender relations should be like, are really, really variable and shift differently according to a number of different factors, like I outlined earlier. The other issue that Ritu asked me to talk about was a bit around what we know about working with gatekeepers, like parents, like partners, like employers, to try to shift norms around women's work. So if we could move to the next slide, please, that I'll just take a couple of minutes to talk about some of the insights from that. Oh, we seem to have lost the slide I was hoping to use, but that's fine. I pulled up a couple of points on that. Interestingly, going back over the studies, I expected to find more on engaging with parents of young women than I actually did. I came across a couple of programs that talked about how they'd engaged with parents to try to persuade them to let their daughters undertake skills training, to let them open bank accounts and to start saving regularly. And few studies actually quantify the difference it made between just working with young women and engaging with their parents as well. But their qualitative observations are that inviting parents along to open sessions about those courses made them a lot more supportive. And also, where those programs try to involve life skills and empowerment type training alongside the skills training, parents are very much more supportive if they've been brought on board with the process first. I think there was also some really interesting examples in the reviews I looked at, particularly the one from MasterCard, about engaging with employers. So one of their partners is an organisation in South Africa that acts a bit like an employment broker for young women who've been through training courses, and then they're trying to find work in the trade or the area that they've done their training in. And so this partner that they help young women to find employment, but they're very careful about how they place them. So they won't, for example, place someone or try to broker their employment to somewhere where there's a history of discrimination or sexual harassment. And they also provide information to young women about what they should do if they face any workplace discrimination or harassment. So there's an element of helping them be aware of their rights, but also an element of sort of slowly, subtly trying to shift norms about what's acceptable for for how somebody should experience employment in the workplace, just by saying, well, you know, you can't have them if this is going to happen. This is one of our requirements. And so it starts to make employers think, okay, maybe that isn't acceptable. And actually, one of the studies from the Grow work also found that where a boss of a small scale mining company, these were all kind of sort of small to medium sized mining concessions, where a supervisor had taken a strong line against sexual harassment, that started to create a norm that it wouldn't be tolerated. So it wasn't just that men were afraid that they would lose their jobs, so that was part of it, but they were also sort of starting to police others and create a norm that this wasn't an acceptable way to behave in and of itself. So I just really wanted to highlight those two examples, which I think are interesting. I think that we've not found so many examples of working with employers to try to promote a more gender sensitive approach. There are some examples also of training programs where there are incentives or strong encouragement to have a good gender balance among trainees, and that often means actively encouraging women to go into more traditional fields. But then there's a question about how effective and sustainable that is if they will then face a large number of barriers to working in those fields afterwards. And so that has to be part of the picture as well. I also think it's interesting that I think a lot of the innovation in this space is coming from partnerships sort of between private employers and private foundations, or sometimes NGOs, but not so much sort of from traditional development actors. And I think that there's some interesting things to be learned from that. So I'll stop there, and looking forward to hearing both from our next speakers and to any questions that you've got.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Rachel. I think a couple of really interesting points is how the value of the opportunity, either the earning potential or the quality of labor or quality of the job, can have an impact on how relaxed the social norm becomes, or how suspended the norm is. But very interesting that very hard to change social norms as opposed to just suspend them temporarily. So we can come back to that point. Now we're going to hear from Liz Vance on the IYF team, who will talk about some of the interesting work that's been done specifically with parents. Liz is just sharing her screen now. Great, thank you, Liz. And when you're ready, I think you can unmute yourself.
Okay, great. Now I'm unmuted. Thank you. Can you hear me? I'll assume that's a yes. So I will speak today about two experiences with career guidance in Mexico. While career guidance is commonplace in Mexico, it is completely divorced from information about the local context and doesn't lead to meaningful decision making. So while students are encouraged to reflect on what they'd like to do with their professional lives, they are not encouraged to take decisions about their course of studies based on information about the opportunities available to them. At the same time, degree program choice has a huge impact on earning income potential. So I want to start here with an illustration from Mexico. To illustrate how we've addressed aligning enrollment to industry needs, we'll look at a campus in Guadalupe, a city in the Monterrey metro area in Mexico. The campus office, it's right there where the blue dot is. The campus offers 4 degrees, each one graduating between 80 to 120 students a year. What happens when you contrast this information with the vacancies? Important quantitative gaps appear. Students are not enrolled in proportion to industry demand, as demonstrated both by the number of vacancies and the salaries. This information needs to be interpreted and shared with parents and students so that they can make better decisions about which program they enroll in. We piloted it in this campus and all other campuses in the States in that state new procedures to share this information with students during the first semester to facilitate degree program changes before they are locked into their degree programs and officially can change program without suffering any loss of school credit. So we also know at the same time that you can't just start with information about income earning potential. And inundating young people with labor market information alone is not enough. It leads to information overload, and it doesn't start with where young people are. Instead, through a structured curriculum and active learning methodology, we start by engaging youth where they are, guiding them to reflect on their interests, values, and skills. Then we help them to understand their context through labor market information and information about career ladders in order to chart their path to their goals. In other words, we help young people understand themselves, their goals, and their context so that they can chart a viable path to achieve their goals. The course concludes with an opportunity to change or confirm their degree program, with school staff on hand to facilitate this transition. So the degree program changes substantially increased in the first cohort of the intervention. Particularly notable is the fact that a good number of men and women chose to change to a degree program related to advanced assembly supply chain, which is the most important sector in that state. In Nuevo León, the state where annually over 10,000 students participate in IYF's career orientation curriculum, IYF was able to document positive trends related to degree program changes. The majority of the degree program changes were into degree programs with high earning potential. Young women abandoned low earning degree programs that conform to traditional gender roles. After sharing these results with the National Coordinator for School to Business Collaboration, at the Undersecretary for Upper Secondary Education, IYF was invited to help revise the revise and restructure the content of the National Model for Career Orientation. So I'd like to sort of show you guys this information. So this is enrollment on the left-hand side. You see enrollment in the first semester when they were taking this career orientation course. And on the right side, you can see what enrollment looked like in the second semester. And these are just the students that changed programs. Now, and you're actually seeing the flow of students from one to the next. The pink lines are young women and the blue lines are young men. The width of the line is how many moved. And as you can see, there were important shifts mainly into industrial electromechanics, which is not a traditionally female degree program. It tends to lead to jobs in advanced manufacturing. And you saw people leaving or sort of running away from degree programs in informatica, which sounds like computing, but it looks a lot like computer repair, which really doesn't have a lot of legs to it in terms of a career choice. So that's one. And then another key point, and this is what Ritu highlighted, is in the decision-making process is when parents come with their daughters and sons to enroll them in public high school. Typically, parents and public high school students in Mexico have not completed high school themselves and may be unfamiliar with important considerations for choosing training programs for their children. Unfortunately, this leads to a large number of parents who ask, where are all the other young women? And then they enroll their daughters in those degree programs, typically administrative, design, and caring careers like childcare, most of which has significantly lower earning potential than more industrial degree programs. So we designed and piloted a parent workshop, which led by the principal. This workshop starts by asking parents to share with a neighbor a bit about their children's values, interests, preferences, and abilities to encourage them to consider their child as an individual. We start here also because parents are comfortable and enjoy sharing or bragging about their children, what they can do and what makes them special. Next, the principal shares with parents information about the career opportunities related to the training programs offered at the school. Here, we're sharing information about the number of applicants for each vacancy in related degree programs at the school. So as you can see, for sales, there are 7 applicants for each vacancies versus in industrial degree in industrial vacancies, there's only 2 versus administrative, there's 5. So you have a much bigger chance as an applicant of getting a job if there's fewer applicants. Here, we're sharing information about the salaries offered related to an industrial degree program. These are in pesos per month. So this is 9, 6, 8, 4, 6, 10. And for a family of 4 to be officially in the middle class, and this can be debated, they need a total income of around 10,500 pesos a month. Adding these salaries to the average family income of public high school students of about 4,800 pesos per month will move them into the middle class. So these are for industrial degree programs. Versus you can see these salaries are much lower available to graduates from administrative degree programs. This is the second bit of information we share with the parents. And then the principal invites parents to continue the conversation at home with their child to learn about the opportunities available locally, what their pay is like, how available they are, what are the commonalities and vacancies that their children are interested in, what are their training requirements, and then trying to figure out what their child can do to increase their competitiveness for the positions that they are most interested in. And with that, I will close. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Liz. And I think what's really interesting is, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen now. What's really interesting, Liz, is that these changes for women's degree programs, even to move into non-traditional occupations, could be influenced by the labor market information, in particular the earning potential information. And I know in this particular project, we did not have the ability to actually examine social norm changes before and after the intervention. But I think it points to something that we all sort of know intuitively, that when women have the potential to earn income, that can trump a lot of other social norms in the minds of partners and families, because earning is more important than adhesion to the social norm in many cases. Great. So we are going to now hear from Prerna Kumar, who is a senior technical advisor for ICRW in India. And just give me a moment to unmute Prerna. And Prerna, if you did send me a PowerPoint presentation, let me know that and I'll go ahead and pull it up. But you are now unmuted, so go ahead.
Thank you, Ritu. Yes, I did share the presentation, so it'll be great if you could pull it out. Otherwise, I have the slide deck ready in case you think that'll be helpful.
Why don't you begin? I will go ahead and pull it out. Not a problem.
Lovely. Thank you very much. And I think after these 2 very interesting presentations, I'll be bringing in the third piece of it, because while Liz talked about how school teachers and headmistress, equip the girls and parents with the information that they really require to make the decision to move into newer kind of jobs and better jobs. We in India here, I've been leading a program called Planet Girls, where one of our pieces was to work with the teachers themselves. And once the slide deck is up, I would really take you through what the process was. But I think even before that, I'll just kind of step back and would like to take you through the journey that we had when we started this particular project called Planet Girls. In 2013, ICRW undertook a mapping of adolescent programs in India, and 2-3 findings that we came up with was that, one, the programming for adolescent girls in India was very, very fragmented and completely, decided based on the mandate of the organization. So if an organization is working on health, they will only work on health for that adolescent girls, or education, they will only focus on education. In this process, what essentially happened was that the girls' needs were not being really addressed in entirety. The other big finding we had was that while the girls were being equipped with some skill or the other, or at least the knowledge, there was very little work happening with the key stakeholders who have and influencers who basically take the decision for her. So there was very little work happening with parents or people who were deciding her life course. And the third big thing that we realized was that a lot of these programs, while they were teaching girls life skills, they were devoid of gender. Somehow the understanding was that life skills are gender neutral, and most programs missed out the fact that life skills were actually gender blind, and therefore making the programs gender blind. So they would have a chapter. Ritu, if you could go on slide 2, this is slide currently. Thank you. So, while girls would be taught a chapter on gender to differentiate between what is sex and what is gender, it did not really get integrated, and the gender lens did not really get integrated into the entire programming. Based on these findings and some of the other piloted work that we did, we actually came up with this program called Planet Girls, which is part of the Grand Challenge for BMGF. And we then created an ecosystem approach-based program where we worked with multiple stakeholders. And we kind of mapped through our formative research that who are the critical influencers and stakeholders in this girl's life who's right at the center of the programming. So while the girl remains at the center of programming, we engage with her male peers, with her parents and communities. We also engage with the teachers, the local businesses and training centers, and the government. And this came through because we realized that the onus of change cannot be on the girl alone. And if that is what happens, the probability of backlash is much higher. And that could actually derail the entire progress that one makes through the program. Not just that, these people influence her day-to-day life and create their environment for her. So this is what we thought was critical to work with. What we also did was we recreated the curriculum which integrated the gender lens into life skills and employability skills. So what we did was we created this curriculum with 4 set of modules where we started from the journey of self and identity, moved into self-efficacy, moved into resourcefulness, and then employability skills, where we talked about soft skills that the girl requires. Also, let me just remind you that all of this is in the context of a country, and I'm talking about India, where the enrollment numbers in secondary education is now gradually becoming almost universal. It's over 90-95%. However, at the same time, the workforce participation rate of women is declining, and it is below, it's almost 1/4, a little over 1/4. And in that context, we realize that it is very, very important that the girls have the soft skills to be able to conduct themselves in a workplace, to be able to have the skill and the mindset to be to actually work as an economic entity themselves. This program is conducted in Delhi. So we worked in 10 government schools of Delhi, and we also worked simultaneously in 10 rural schools of Jharkhand, which is an eastern state. And the 2 districts where we worked, one of the districts is has a huge tribal population, almost 40% tribal population, while the other district does not have. So we worked in an area which was not very easy to work in. And interestingly, I'm right now sitting there. So I'm very happy that I'm actually presenting from Jharkhand right now. The Delhi and Jharkhand scenario was very, very different. Whether we see it in terms of the school infrastructure, the kind of support that the girls have, the kind of access to information, their mobility, their family structures, their socioeconomic conditions, everything was vastly different. So what I'm going to do now is going to just talk about this one piece of engaging with teachers, and and I'll also give you a brief history of why it became an important piece for us. So when we did our baseline study, although already teachers were part of the design, because from our formative we did understand that teachers play a very critical role. in lives of these girls. When we did our formative and we started the program, the baseline, and we started the program, we realized that in most of our Jharkhand schools, teachers were essentially male teachers, because these were rural schools and not many female teachers were, deputed in these schools. And also, some of the schools didn't have sufficient number of teachers. The teacher vacancies were as high as 60%, 70% in some of the schools. So in a scenario like that, we realized that it's very, and at the same time, girls were reporting that teachers are their role models. Time and again, they said that teachers are people whom they really look up to for guidance, for information, and they do feel that they will have an important role to play in their lives. When we started our teachers program, we realized that it's very important to first understand what are the needs of these teachers, because these are also teachers who are working in a rural scenario. They have very little opportunities of self-growth, of learning. And when we did our needs assessment with them, and like I said, most of them were male teachers, we realized that despite the fact that we had a range of teachers in terms of someone with 15, 20 years of experience and even teachers with 2 to 3 years of experience, all of them kind of said in unison that one thing they find difficult was to really manage big classrooms. And their classrooms were big because they don't have enough teachers in the school, so they have to manage bigger groups at the same time. Now, in a scenario like that, we realized that if we want to engage with teachers, we would need to start at their felt need. What is it that they really value? And we cannot jump into what we think is important for them. So we started this journey. We did a workshop, and this is an ongoing process. We are not yet done with this process, but I'm just going to talk about the first bit that we did with them. So after the needs assessment, we, in conjunction and in discussion with the government and the education department, we came up with a 2-day workshop design where we said we will start talking about who an ideal teacher, who an ideal student is, and then we will go on to talk about who an ideal teacher is. Because constantly, so we took them on a journey of self-reflection, and we realized that most of their trainings that the department does are very didactic and very subject specific. So this was one training which we made very, very participatory, and we took them on this self-reflection journey. We started from who's an ideal student, what are the characteristics, and moved on to what are the characteristics of an ideal teacher. And it was very interesting to see that how these groups of teachers kind of realize that while they expect the students to be ideal, they themselves necessarily do not have all the characteristics of an ideal teacher. And then we moved into something, an exercise where we helped them articulate who was a teacher in their life in sense of teaching them something profound for life. And once they started on that journey, they started talking about how they found that one person, and we also talked about what are the characteristics of that one person whom they thought had the most influence on them. They started to really talk about how this person was available to them, how this person was ready to listen to them, and was willing to just hear them out. So this really got us on the journey of realizing that how important it is for a teacher to really hear out their students. And then once we had done this process on day 2, we kind of again started with what was your adolescence like, what were the things that excited you, what were the challenges you faced. Again, taking them back to their adolescence and helping them reflect on it. And it was very interesting because some of them said that, it's now that it is all coming back to us, we are realizing that we have all been through this stage, but we never really think about it when we are dealing with our own students.
Great. So I just want to ask just one more minute, please.
Yes, I'll wrap up. So this entire journey, and then we moved into, so what are the needs of adolescents and how then girls particularly what are the needs of the adolescent girls. Now, this entire journey, helped them really reflect and talk about and make them more sensitive to those needs. And while we haven't really done a formal evaluation, but we have visited the schools after this workshop and met with these teachers. And one thing that we have constantly heard from all the teachers is that the girls are able to now really come and talk to them. So while I'm only talking about the teachers piece, I would say that also the work that we did with the girls and the curriculum that we transacted with the girls had an influence on it. But teachers were extremely happy to say that now we know how to connect with them, and now we know how to communicate with them. Now they ask us relevant questions and they're able to provide them relevant answers. And also we sought some support in our parents and community engagement work. And we realized that all the teachers are more than happy to come forward for community meetings, for meetings with the panchayat, with the local governance bodies and the parents. And I think this is a huge change for us, because these are schools which have not seen a parents-teachers meetings in ages. And that connect between parents and teachers had been missing, and the students and teachers had been missing. I've gone over my time. Thank you very much for a patient hearing. And if you have any questions, please let me know. Thank you, Ritu.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Prerna. And I just want to point out, one of the things that you talked about on the telephone with me was how really starting from where the teachers were and their felt needs, rather than moving into talking about adolescent girls, was critically important into them beginning to, again, relax some of their social norms and biases about adolescent girls. So we've got about 15 minutes for questions, and I've gotten a couple of really excellent questions that I'll put to our panelists. And while they are speaking, if you want to add questions in the chat box, that would be great. So these two questions, I just want to offer them to all of our panelists. The first question was, could you provide any examples of effective partnerships between either NGOs or donors and the private sector in regards to changing social norms around women's employment? And then the second question was around pushback from employers. While girls may be changing their degree programs or changing their occupations based on important information, what kind of pushback have you experienced from the employers who have a strong bias towards male employees? So let's start with those two questions, and then we'll go from there. And let me make sure our panelists are unmuted. Oh. Let's see. I think you can, I think you are, yep, you're able to unmute yourself. So go ahead. Rachel, I see that you might be ready to speak.
Oh, I just am unmuted. I am not by any action of my own, but I will go first if you like. In terms of effective partnerships, I think that there were some really interesting examples in the sample of projects that I looked at. And of course, this is not first-hand experience. It's from looking at evaluations and write-ups. And so, those have to be taken with the fact that they're not from first-hand research. There's one innovative program, which I'm sure Prerna may know of, in Delhi, that works with women to train them to be taxi drivers. And it's a partnership between some private taxi firms and a foundation and an NGO. And I mean, it's quite interesting because the women have to pay a quite large training fee to get their driving license and to become accredited and to learn English and to learn skills that they're going to need as taxi drivers. But the kind of this cluster of organizations that are supporting it provides sort of stipends and opportunities to get loans and tries to help them get finance to do it, because they are all the applicants are low income women from kind of further out sort of slum or lower quality housing areas who wouldn't be able to access this, but are attracted by the program and what it offers, because what they can earn is so much more than what they would be doing in kind of more local trading or home-based work that they'd otherwise be doing. So, and then I think the program is around 6 months of training, and then the numbers that go through are relatively small, and then they've been able to get jobs driving professionally. And the studies I've read of that show a real sort of start to shift in social norms. So people are extremely surprised to have a woman driver, first of all, but and other taxi drivers again were a bit suspicious at first, but seeing that the women are professional and good at their jobs, and have are seen as have all the kind of the symbols that show that they are officially employed and they have their licenses and so on, such as a uniform and ID cards and everything like that. That's really started to change perceptions, and also within their families it started to change perceptions about what they should be doing, and how the family can accommodate the fact that now it's a woman who's bringing in this really quite substantial income compared to what the family had before or could otherwise get. So that's one example, but I think it is a really interesting model.
Great, thank you. And Prerna and Liz, I know you both wanted to add.
So I would just like to answer the question on, pushback. And one of the things that we constantly hear from a lot of these, because we are working with adolescent girls, and what we did was we did career fairs for these adolescent girls, where we invited a lot of these training centers and vocational and skill training centers to talk to them about the opportunities that are locally available. And today only I was talking to someone again, one of the training centers, and when we asked them that why is it that you don't really open up some of the courses for these girls, their biggest pushback is that the families don't allow them to really go for residential programs. And he talked about how it's risky for a training institute to really bring in girls for 3 weeks or 4 week program, because you don't know what will happen. So it is all in the garb of that it's unsafe for girls, and what if something happens. Essentially, it is a control over their sexuality largely, where I think there is this sense that the family honor could actually take a beating if the girl goes out and if she engages in any kind of relationship. So that's one pushback that we constantly see, despite the fact that the government has absolutely no gender bifurcation in terms of what skills a woman can acquire or what skills a man can acquire. Somehow automatically there are courses that are assigned to girls. So for instance, tailoring, beautician, computer course, these are things that are absolutely acceptable. But anything beyond that, where the girl has to move out of the family, where the girl has to where the girl has larger or greater engagement with men or boys, or is away from family, are seen as very, very risky.
Great, thank you. And I know those social norms are particularly sticky, very, very difficult to change. Liz?
Sure. So I wanted to sort of take this on a couple fronts. I think in some areas we have a huge benefit. In Mexico, there's a quote that's famous in Mexico that is, "Poor Mexico, so far from God and so close to the US." However, I believe that being part of international supply chains can exert some really interesting pressure on local suppliers in the Mexican labor market, both the OEMs, so the people that put together the final product, like the car, so like the Fords, the GMs, the VWs, but also their suppliers down the line. The international firms hold, in many cases, the local offices and their suppliers to international standards of gender equity in some cases and in the best cases. And this leads to, in the best cases, hiring managers being desperate to find women with particular technical skills. And so one thing that we hear repeatedly is that if they can find a female forklift operator, they'll pay her a director level salary. And that, I think, is a little bit of an exaggeration, but it is something that is increasing pressure on hiring managers in Mexico, is the relationship to the international supply chain. That's one area. A second area that I'd like to highlight is that our approach to working with industries is really focused on addressing a felt skills gap. So we generally work with firms that are, and their supply chain, that are part of an industrial sector in a particular region that are facing talent, a gap between the talent that they need and the talent that's available in the local labor market, which can lead to increasing salaries, which hurts their bottom line. And under those pressures, we're able to broker interesting partnerships between the technical vocational schools and the firms that are suffering this talent gap to insert those technical skills into the curriculum. And another, finally, very interesting area that we've started to do work around is how, I think when I look at career orientation, I often think of that as sort of like a mid to long range intervention in terms of gender equity, in terms of employment opportunities. And what I've seen as a much more short time frame intervention is trying to say, well, where are the women at right now in terms of their enrollment? And oftentimes they're in these low earning degree programs, administrative, some sort of graphic design, stuff where they're sort of far from the factory floor. And what we found is that there are a host of income earning opportunities related to logistics, import, export, as well as IT that are very much linked to these industrial supply chains that can help that offer very competitive salaries. And so we've forged ahead with partnerships with industry leaders in those sectors to try and have a value add on top of those training programs to help transform someone who would graduate as like an administrative technician into a logistics technician, which can in some cases quadruple her earning potential. And so those have been some interesting partnerships that we've been able to have with firms that are part of international supply chains on the one hand, and or are facing a skills gap so that they aren't able to find qualified applicants in the local market.
Great, thank you so much for that, Liz. We have another question about whether these programs, in addition to the economic benefits that help shift social norms, if that helped increase women's agency, particularly her agency over her life at home, because she herself became more valuable to the family. And I know from other research that's been done, particularly in the area of microenterprise and women's rising incomes, that can be an impact. Not always, but it can, and I would love the perspective of the three of you on that. Anyone, just jump right in.
Talk about our experience of working with adolescent girls, and I would say that we've just completed our inline survey and we are still analyzing the data, but what we are definitely finding is that there is a positive shift in the girl's perception of her own self. And I think that is something which we are finding very, very interesting. So while we are yet to see whether she'll be able to take decisions in her life on her own, and how much say would she really have in that decision making, but we are also seeing that now greater proportion of girls are feeling that they have a better say in what they want to study, how much they want to study, whom they want to marry, but they may not yet be the final decision makers. And that's something, which one has to be cautious about, because these are also younger girls and younger women. So I think what we would need is a follow-up study to really see how this program, which has a huge component of skills, life skills, family compatibility skills, are really able to translate that in their life, especially as adults. So.
Great. Thank you so much. Liz or Rachel?
I'm happy I think one of the things that really has come out from our research, we did a series of focus groups with young women in another region of Mexico about what their expectations were for both their professional and personal lives, is that some of these things that we think of as decisions young women hadn't really come to identify them as decision points. Or being critical decision points. And so I think one of the power of this intervention is to help young people start to see themselves as people who are making decisions and identifying decisions that they're making. And we came to this realization in looking at the results of this engagement with several focus groups of young women, where we were asking them to develop a timeline for what they hoped for and expected in their lives. And they were, to some degree, they had parallel tracks that wouldn't work with each other necessarily. So we had young women that aspired to go to college, complete a degree in university, and at the same time expected to be pregnant before they finished high school. And so it was very interesting to us to start to pull apart these what's assumed and what's aspired and what is planned for, and helping young people start to think about the decisions that they're making assertively. And I think that that's something that is also, when we think about these technical degree programs, these are decisions that a young person is enrolling in high school when they're 14 and 15 years old, and they're asked to make a decision about what they're supposed to do with the rest of their life. And frankly, as a 14 and 15-year-old, I don't know what you guys wanted to be, but I don't think that I had all the tools I needed. And particularly when you're under a lot of social pressures about what is appropriate to you, I feel like one of the key parts of our intervention was really helping young people identify, this is a decision. You make decisions. Other people make decisions that impacts you, and helping them start to see themselves more as agents than subjects of their lives. I think that that's something that a lot of people start to do at 15, and that's a developmental process. And I think that it's often out of line. The developmental process that people go through is out of line with the timeline for training, and that it asks young people to take such huge decisions when they are so young and haven't necessarily received any kind of preparation, both in terms of like the information that they need, but also the skills around identifying and taking decisions.
Great. Well, thank you so much, everyone. We don't have time for any more questions. It's just now the top of the hour. So thanks so much for joining us. We will have this posted on the IYF website and available to everyone. So we'll be in touch with you with the link to that. And thanks again. We'll be in touch with our next webinar soon.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, everybody.